Welcome to Eyes on Books. We're so glad you could join us today, and we really think you'll enjoy our discussion. Steve and I are going to tell you about Lisa C.'s novel, The Island of Sea Women. And after we describe it and discuss it, Lisa will actually be joining us on Zoom, and we'll be able to ask her some of our own questions. So I hope you enjoy it. Okay, Steve, you're going to start. Could you tell us about the Sea Women and who they were and what they represented?
Yeah, they actually, you can see the picture up here on the book. They wore certain uniforms that when they went into the water. And back in the 30s and 40s, it was a difficult time for the Korean people, especially on this island, where the Japanese had invaded and had a lot of restrictions. And so the Sea Women were the ones who brought home food from the sea. That was their source, like urchins and octopuses and so on and so forth. And so they were the ones who actually were the bread and butter winners. And the men actually took care of the children and did the cooking. Mm-hmm. And so it was very interesting. It's very interesting to learn about that culture, which I had no idea. But, you know, the women were very brave. Mm-hmm. You know, they would take like 3 breaths and then jump in. I mean, they're in the water, but they would go down below for I don't know how long, as long as they could hold their breath, mm-hmm. and go down. And they had like a basket, and they put the urchins and the octopuses and other fish and so on and so forth, and then come to the surface and give it back to the boat that they jumped off of, mm-hmm. and. I was just very impressed by their bravery, and also as a man, I felt a little bit for the husbands who, these were kind of reverse roles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they were free divers. They just went right down there and collected whatever they could and sold it and took some of it home for food.
Right. I was going to ask you about the Jeju and the 3 forces.
Oh, the island, yes. Jeju is an interesting island, and the way it is located, it's very strategic. If you look at the map, it's located off the South Korean coast, but within not a very far distance from Japan. Mm-hmm. So it kind of has been used during a lot of different invasions and occupations. Mm. But the island was known for what were called its 3 abundances, and they were wind, women, and stone. Mm. And the wind there was quite ferocious at times, from what I understand. The women, to me, were the prize of that island because of their diving skills and their producing food for their families and selling a lot of those products they collected to get money to buy other things for their families. And then stone, the houses were built out of the local stone, walls were built out of that stone. It was just a self-sufficient island. Mm-hmm. Very interesting. And one of the things in this story has to do with the friendship between 2 girls, Mija and Young Suk. So, Steve, maybe you can tell us about that friendship and how it started and how it grew.
Yeah, it was very interesting. Again, the women were in the forefront of protesting about the conditions that were imposed by the Japanese. And so what happened was that Young Suk's mother was protesting and was almost going to get arrested. And Mija her mother rescued her from being arrested. And so they really, in a very fast way, became real close bosom buddies. They did everything together, and Young Suk's mother took Mija in because her Mija's parents were killed, and she had to go live with her aunt and uncle, who were not that nurturing, or she didn't get a lot of nurturing, so she really liked going over to Mija's home with her mom, and fed her and kind of took her under her wing, and so it was a very what could have been a lifelong friendship, but as you read in the book, you'll find out that there's some bumps in the road.
And they both became Henya, which is the Korean name for the free divers, these women who we just told you about.
Right.
So one thing that also played importance in the story was a book that Mija had that contained rubbings that her father had made over time. And the girls ended up using that quite a bit. And it actually told the story of their lives. And it was important because they were illiterate.
Right.
And the rubbings told their story without having to use words.
Right.
So that was an interesting part of the book too, I thought.
Yeah, when I thought about the rubbings, I remember when I was in grade school, we would take a piece of paper and, let's say, a piece of chalk or a piece of coal and rub it across the rock, and all the little nooks and crannies on the rock would come through. And since the girls did not know how to read, or they would do this wherever they went, like when they went to Russia and did some diving there, and all these new things that they've never seen before. They did a lot of rubbings and kind of gave them the memories of that particular situation.
Yeah, and Steve just mentioned them going to Russia, and that was another interesting thing. Not only did these women dive on their home island and collect their products for sale there, but when times were tough and the families needed more money, the girls would outsource to areas like Vladivostok, where they would dive. And just thinking about how cold it must have been there, it was astounding that they were able to do that. And not only that, on, I believe, their second trip up there, they were both pregnant and actually gave birth to these babies while they were outsourced in Russia.
Right.
So it was quite amazing how strong they were and how flexible with traveling and doing this skill of theirs almost anywhere they were sent.
What's amazing is, for me, coming from Arizona, anything below 75 degrees is very cold. And for them to jump into these, these cold waters, and especially when they're pregnant.
I know.
I mean, you have to believe that they are really tough women.
And what they really wanted was to give birth underwater. That was important to them. And Young Suk, I believe it was, at one point had to come on board the ship to deliver her baby.
Right.
But they would have liked to stay in the water.
Yeah.
Now, you had mentioned their friendship hit some bumps. What actually happened in 1949 that caused a really big problem with their friendship?
Well, not to give the whole story away, but there was a massacre by, I think, the Japanese and maybe North Koreans who they, for some reason, they turned on the people.
One of the goals of all these militant people was to prevent communism from infiltrating
Right.
into the country.
Right.
And a lot of the people who were massacred really wanted a more democratic and a more united Korea.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't like being
Right.
pushed around politically.
Yeah.
And thousands were killed during
Right.
these
Right.
uprisings. And there was the one massacre in particular where Mija and Young Suk were both there.
Right.
But the one thing was Mija's husband was a collaborator, and he collaborated and therefore had some pull to get Mija out of the massacre.
Right. After a break, we're going to turn it over to our guest, Lisa C., who is the author, and we have some interesting questions we'd like to ask her about her book.
Yep.
We're here to get to know Lisa C., the author of our book, The Island of Sea Women. And I just want to say that I really enjoyed The Island of Sea Women, even though I'm a man. Female friendships are so important. And you talk about Mika and Young-suk and how they're so close, just like chopsticks. And most of your books involve relationships with women. And can you tell us a little bit about how you came up with the friendship and the dynamics of the friendship and so on?
Yes. Well, first, let me just say thank you so much for having me today. It's really nice, in this time when we can't all be together in person, to at least get to visit virtually. So thank you for having me. And anyway, to answer your question, first, I just want to say one thing. Yes, maybe you're a man, but men read my books. that's not a barrier to anybody.
You're right.
So you're right, though, that I do write a lot about women and women's relationships. I mean, I am a woman. Most of my books are about women. Most of the readers, even though there are plenty of male readers, most of the readers are women as well. And so I've written about mothers and daughters, sisters, best friends for life, just even plain friendship. And for me, the thing is, I sort of see this as still very untapped material. I'm going to give you a little history lesson here on, literature. If we think about the whole sort of Western canon of literature, you have Shakespeare writing about women, you have, Tolstoy writing about women, all, centuries and centuries of men writing women characters. And there are a few other women writers in there, Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, George Eliot, but they're pretty few and far between. And it's really not until Virginia Woolf, about 100 years ago, who starts really writing about women, and then that kind of opens up a door for other women to write about women. And I do feel like this is still very fresh material. It's still very raw in a lot of ways. There's still a lot of things to explore about female friendship in particular. One of the things that really intrigues me is this is a unique relationship that we have in our lives. We will tell our friend something that we wouldn't tell a husband, a boyfriend, a lover, our mother, our children. So it's a very particular kind of intimacy. And so whenever, of course, you have that, you are opening your heart and you're vulnerable to being hurt. So when I'm writing about female friendship, I'm always kind of looking for the dark shadow side. And wherever I see those dark shadows, that's where I want to go.
Well, one thing I wanted to mention to you, Lisa, when my granddaughter was in ninth grade, she read Snowflower and the Secret Fan. And I told her that you were going to be speaking in Mission Viejo at the book fair, and she wanted to come and hear you speak. And she did, and she loved it, and she loves your books. She's a big reader. But what I wanted to mention to you is she's now a high school English teacher in LA. So I'm sure she's still thinking about you and your books. So
well, that's wonderful. That's wonderful to hear. And I hear that a lot, about Snowflower and the Secret Fan in particular. That book has been published in 39 different languages.
Oh my goodness.
I think one reason why it's, turned out to be so successful worldwide is that I was writing, again, about female friendship in a way that maybe people hadn't really read before. And that it was, not just in this very different culture, in a very different time, the stuff about foot binding, the stuff about the secret writing system that the women of this one very remote county in China had invented, used, and kept a secret for 1,000 years. So there's all that. But at the heart of that book is this friendship. And you see a kind of parallel, and actually a sort of almost parallel structure in The Island of Sea Women to Snowflower and the Secret Fan.
Well, I'm sure she's still a fan, and I'll be happy to tell her I met you today, more or less. I had a question about the Henya culture in general. When Young-suk and Mija were growing up, the girls were not educated at all. And then, of course, as times changed, they were, and they chose other careers. So what is going to happen to that culture? Because it was something that was passed from mother to daughter, and the daughters are just not really interested. What do you think?
Right. So on the island of Jeju, girls could not go to public school until 1978, not that long ago.
Gosh.
And even that required fees. So before, they did have one private school for girls, but these divers never, ever could have afforded that. So starting in 1978, these divers started saving up their money so that they could send their daughters and granddaughters to school. And those daughters and granddaughters went through elementary school, junior high, high school, college, university. And I was very lucky while I was there, not only to interview the divers themselves, but also to interview that first generation of girls who were educated. One woman who really stands out to me, she was, again, the first girl in her family to go to school. And she eventually wrote her, has a PhD in English, wrote her dissertation on, of all people, Ezra Pound. And so, she took me to meet her mother, who was 93 at the time. Her mother was the daughter of Japanese collaborators. It was an incredible day of stories and incredible emotion. But her daughter was the one who did all of this translation. So to answer your question very directly, in the late 1970s, there were still about 40,000 of these divers. And they would retire at age 55 if they lived that long. This is very dangerous work. You can get your hair caught in something. You can get a tool caught in something. You can be hit by a boat. You can get tangled in a forest of kelp. You can be, get a cut, and that's an invitation for lunch to all the sharks in the neighborhood. You can run out of air. You can have, get the bends. All these ways that women would die. So, if they lived that long, they would retire at age 55. Today, there are only about 4,000 of these divers left, and the youngest one is 55. So many of the divers that I interviewed were in their 70s, 80s, early 90s, still diving. Now, UNESCO 5 years ago gave the divers the designation of an intangible World Heritage tradition. And part of the reason they did that was that UNESCO is anticipating that this culture would disappear within 15 years, so 10 years from today. So we're really coming to the end. And these young women who were educated, they don't have to risk their lives every day to harvest abalone and, look for other sea creatures. They can be teachers. They can work in shops. They can work, there's a big tourism industry now on Jeju, so they could work in hotels and be at the concierge desk. All these things that you're not actually putting your life on the line every time you enter the sea.
I have a question, just out of curiosity. How long could the divers stay underwater?
2 to 4 minutes on a single breath.
One area of the island I thought was so interesting were the walking paths, the ole, and it seemed like the villagers would go to those ole just sometimes to get privacy, or young couples just to try to get away from their families, and also to walk from one place to another. That was their main route. What about those walking paths now? Are they still in existence, and do people
absolutely
still use them?
So this was historically how people went from village to village around the island. They still exist. They're still used. I mean, they're made out of the stone of that's found on the island, so they're not going to fall apart or anything. There is a tour group that actually now has, you can do like 10-day walking tours around the island following the ole trails.
Wow.
So, maybe somebody's watching this right now and think, yeah,
Would be interesting.
the pandemic is over. I'm going to go do a 10-day hiking trip on these ancient pathways.
Beautiful views from up there, though, I'm sure, from a lot of those paths.
Thank you for all this information.
Yeah.
It's I feel like I was in class.
Oh, now.
No, not.
I hope
not
it was
that
a little
too-
more entertaining than a class.
You are, but you're an entertaining teacher. And can you talk about what books you're working on now? Because what we can look forward to.
Yeah, so I do think about books for a very long time before I write them. I thought I knew what the next book was going to be. I'd been quietly collecting material for about 4 years. And then, the problem with it was going to require a trip deep, deep, deep into a very remote part of China. And so I was all set to start that last year, and then the pandemic came, and no way to do that last year, no way to do that this year. I'm still pretty dubious about trips like that, even into next year, putting aside the fact that China has very stringent quarantine for visitors. It's still at 3 weeks. You have to stay in a government hotel before you can actually, go into China.
Wow.
So I had to put that aside for now. And so actually, as of today, I'm about a chapter and a half from finishing the first draft for a new book that's based on a true story on a real woman who was a physician in the Ming Dynasty. Now, that's not that extraordinary. China does have a history of female doctors going back about 2,000 years. Not a lot of them, but enough that it didn't, make my brain explode or anything. But this woman, Dr. Tan, in 1510, published a book of her cases. That book is not only in print in China, it's available in English, it's available in languages all over the world, because her treatments are still used in traditional Chinese medicine today. Plus, she was just this extraordinary person. So, at the very beginning, we were talking about, books written by women, about women. They're so few and far between. And so if you think even just generally about what has survived from before 1510 that is still in print today. So you have the Bible, the Iliad, the Odyssey, some Greek dramas, but really Beowulf, but very, very little that has survived and is still in print all these years later. And I have yet to find anything written by a woman before 1510 that is still in print today. So, quite apart from what an extraordinary person she was, I just think that the fact that this even exists is extraordinary, and I'm just very excited about bringing her story to the world.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. I can't wait.
Is it going to be somewhat of a mystery?
Well, all of my books always have a little tiny element of a mystery in them, I think.
Yeah, yeah. So we really are.
But can I just say very quickly?
Yeah.
But you're right. This book maybe it does have a little bit more, because the other book that I have found that was published in China in about 1300 was the first book ever written on forensic medicine.
Oh, wow.
And in China, that book is still used today by people who are doing forensic science.
Talking about tradition.
So, this again was an extraordinary person. And then to use some of that material, on the one hand, you have a doctor. On the other hand, you have someone who's looking at death from a different perspective.
Wow. We feel very fortunate that you shared all this information and got to meet you. You're really a sweet person, but very knowledgeable. And we want to thank you, and perhaps we'll have another book of yours for our books, Eyes on Books. And I'm going to say that we really enjoyed this book, and we hope that you will tune in next month for another Eyes on Book, and interviewing the author, because that's gives it such depth and understanding of where the author was coming from.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you, Lisa. We really appreciate it.
Thank you both.
Thank you.